And here we have our canned stew, and it looks fantastic. Thank you for stopping by to see what's going on in my kitchen today. You never know what you're going to find me doing. Today I'm actually doing something I haven't done in quite some time. I'm canning beef stew. Now, I bet all of you knew that, and maybe even have tried your hand at it, making jams and jellies and canning vegetable and freezing everything. But have you ever tried canning meat? Now, my mother was born early in the 1900s. She was 15 at the beginning of the Great Depression. And so she remembers how things were at that time. A lot of people didn't have anything to eat. She was lucky in that her family had land and they grew and raised most of the food that they ate. They raised the crops and raised a calf, I think, every year for food, and at least a hog or two, and chickens, so they had eggs, and they had a cow for milk, so they had most everything they needed except for coffee and sugar and flour maybe. But they had things that they could trade for what they didn't have. Anyway, at that time they ate meat out of the smokehouse for most of the year, but toward the end of the summer the meat would be rank and they wouldn't have anything to eat except for the canned meat that her mother put up. She put it up in jars every year, and that's what they'd eat in between about the middle of summer or toward the end of the summer, and in the fall when they were able to kill a hog, and then they had fresh meat for a while. But you do have to pressure cook meat because it's low acid food. You have to can it in a pressure canner. You can't do it in a boiling water bath. So even though you're not supposed to have to sterilize your jars when you're pressure canning, I always sterilize my jars before I put any kind of food in it. So in my pressure canner, it's kind of doing double duty today. Right now, it's a boiling water bath. Pardon me. It is sterilizing my jars. So I've got 2 to 3 inches of water in the bottom of my pressure canner, and I've got 9 pint jars being sterilized. As a matter of fact, they've been boiling now for 10 minutes, so they are ready to use. And in my Dutch oven, I've got a little over a pound of ground beef that I've browned and drained. So I'm ready now to continue with my beef stew recipe. So I'm going to turn my fire back on. I was just chopping my onions, and I put about a cup of chopped onions and about half a cup of celery, all chopped up. So I'm putting those in with my ground beef, and I'm going to saute them until the onions are tender and clear. Okay, so my onions and celery are tender now, and I'm going to add some spices. I'm going to add about a teaspoon and a half of dry mustard. Teaspoon and a half of dry mustard. I'm going to add a half teaspoon of oregano, dried oregano. Those in. And normally I would add 2 tablespoons of flour here, but because I'm canning, the stew, I'm not going to add the flour until after I open one of the jars and prepare it for a meal. So I'm going to leave the flour out, but normally I would put 2 tablespoons of flour at this point. And I forgot to add my garlic before, so I'm using the minced garlic out of the jar. So I'm going to add the 4 cloves. Two teaspoons of the minced garlic. And at this point, I'm going to add 4 cups of beef broth. So what I'm doing is adding 4 cups of water. And I use the Better Than bouillon, and I'll be adding 4 teaspoons. Actually, I add about 5 teaspoons of the Better Than bouillon and 4 cups of water. Let me turn the fire back up under this to get it going. And I just dropped my spoon in. Okay, so the jars are now ready to go. I had prepared them before. I checked them to be sure they were still sound and no nicks or cracks. Washed them and rinsed them well. And now they've been sitting in boiling water for more than 10 minutes. So they're ready for the food. And I have on the back a little saucepan with boiling water in it, because I'll drop the lids in just shortly, right before I start to put the stew in the jars, and keep them hot until I'm ready to use them. But also, I have to make sure before we start the pressure cooker process, then we have to make sure we have 2.5 or 3 inches of water in the bottom of the pan. of the pot. Okay, now what we're doing here, we're canning by using the hot pack method because my food is going to be hot when I put it in the jars. So we want the water in the pressure canner to be boiling when we put the jars of food into the canner. Okay, so we've got between a pound and a quarter of ground beef that we've browned and drained so that we don't have a lot of fat in here. And then we put in our onions and celery and sauteed those, about a cup and a half total, a cup of onions and a half cup of celery. And then we put 1.5 teaspoons of dry mustard, a half teaspoon of oregano, 4 teaspoons of, 4 cloves of garlic, and we need to put some salt in also. So I'm going to grab the salt over here. And we'll put about a teaspoon and a half of salt into the stew. And we're going to let that come back to the boil. Now we don't have to cook this completely because it'll finish cooking in the pressure canning process. But this is a very quick stew recipe anyway, if you're not canning it. So our last ingredients that go in the stew, we're putting in 2 diced potatoes, and about 2.5 cups of mixed vegetables. Now I'm doing carrots, peas, green beans, and corn, but you can do frozen mixed vegetables or whatever your favorite vegetables are. But I'm putting those in. And I'm going to bring it back to a boil. And then we're going to fill our jars that are all sterilized and ready to go. And I did have to add a little bit of water into the pressure canner because some of it had evaporated while the jars were sterilizing. But it's got about 3 inches, 2.5 to 3 inches of water in the pot. And I have my water boiling in a small saucepan here, and I'm going to go ahead and drop my lids in now. And then I'll reduce the heat and just let them sit in the hot water. So here we go. I'm going to start filling the jars now. So we've got the stew into the jars, and what we're going to have is 5 pints from this recipe. So we've got them filled, and I left 1 inch of headspace. Be sure you leave that 1 inch of headspace. I've had to add a little bit more water to the hot boiling water to the pressure canner. I think I'll put just teeny bit more, just to be sure. That gives us our 3 inches. And I've wiped the rims of the jars good. And I'm going to add the lids that are sitting in boiling water. We can reuse our jars and our rings, but we can't reuse our lids. They have to be new lids. So now we're going to put on our rings. And this is what the stew looks like before it's processed. Put the rings on snugly, but not over tight. This is hot work. Now we have our 5 pints of beef stew. And I left some extra jars in there, empty jars, so that the jars aren't moving around while they're processing. And now I'm going to take the lid to the pressure canner and be sure the ring or the gasket is in place. And now we're going to put the lid on the canner. Alright. Now we let the steam build up, the pressure build up, and steam will start escaping from the steam vent. And we're going to let the steam escape for 10 minutes before we put our steam vent cover or the petcock on. So right now we're just waiting for the steam to build up. And when the steam has built up and it's visible, then you time it for 10 minutes. You can also add tomatoes to this recipe. It's very good with tomatoes in it. I didn't put any in today's batch, but most of the time I do add tomatoes as well. Our steam has been escaping now for about 6 minutes from the pressure canner. So in 4 more minutes I'll be able to put the vent cover or the petcock on top of the steam vent. Steam has now been escaping from the steam vent for 10 minutes. So we're going to put the vent cover or the steam vent petcock, and we're going to make sure we're on the 10-pound mark, and we're going to put it on the steam vent. And now we have to wait until the steam gets built up to a sufficient level that it starts rocking or jiggling or whatever this one does. And then we'll start timing the canning process. We have to can the beef stew in pints for 70 minutes. If you were using quarts, you'd process for 90 minutes. But for now, we're waiting for the steam to get back up into the pot to a sufficient level to start the process to work. So now the pressure is up in our pressure canner, and you can hear the noise that the petcock makes when it's processing. And it's telling us that it's working. So I reduced the heat just the slightest amount. Now if you reduce it too much and the petcock stops rocking, then you have to increase it to the right temperature so that it will rock, and then you start the timing process all over again. You don't just do part of it now and part of it the next time. It has to be for 70 minutes continuously. So be sure that you keep the burner under it turned on to a high enough heat that it will continue to rock and continue to process. So now we'll start the timing and we'll process for 70 minutes. At that time, what we do is just turn the burner off, turn the heat off, and let it sit till it's cool. We don't want to try to cool it down quickly because that's part of the process. The cooling down portion of the process is very important to the entire process. So be sure to let it cool down naturally. Our pressure canner has cooked for 70 minutes, and we're in the process of just leaving it alone and letting it cool down. And maybe in an hour or so we'll be able to take a look at our jars of beef stew and see what they look like. So we remove the petcock and let the pot just sit unopened for 10 more minutes. And then I've just opened it up, and here we have our canned stew, and it looks fantastic. Thanks again for stopping by. If you found this video to be helpful, please like and subscribe.